Since the beginning of human history, music has served as a way for people to connect with one another, share ideas, and to portray emotional experiences. It's a medium quite unlike any other, one which has been studied by countless scholars and enjoyed by virtually everyone at some point in their lives. To put it bluntly, music is just cool, and when people who look cool make cool music, that's what we call rock and roll. Rock is hands down one of the largest and most celebrated genres of music out there, originating in the 1940s and 50s, though it's safe to say that rock has splintered into a number of separate subgenres over time. When you think of rock and roll, there's probably a number of influential people and groups that come to mind. Elvis Presley, Ozzy Osbourne, Aerosmith, AC/DC, the list goes on. But with all these legendary figures in mind, I think it's safe to say there's been one extraordinarily influential rock group simply unlike any other. A group whose profound talent, paired with anti-war lyricism, played a key part in the movement of not just art, but of the world at large. I'm of course talking about Samurai, the fictional chrome rock group from the world of Cyberpunk. If you walk or drive around the streets of Night City for long enough, you're bound to hear some of this group's music on the radio or at a street corner. They're pretty much everywhere you go, and the group still receives a fair amount of play even in 2077, which is pretty impressive since the band broke up nearly 70 years earlier in 2008. That's a very long span of time to still attain this level of relevance. But what some may not know is the turbulent history of the group, from creation to cultural impact to breakup to Night City revolution. So today, why don't we take a look back at the full history of Samurai, the Dark Future's most influential band of all time. This story takes place over a somewhat shorter span of time than our usual excursions into the world of Cyberpunk. In total, Samurai as a group was only together for about half a decade, but to set the scene, we have to go back a little bit further than that. In fact, we have to go back to before the turn of the century, more specifically to the year 1988, where on November 16th, in College Station, Texas, a young boy would be born. His name, Robert John Linder. Very little is known about Linder's early childhood. His family and economic situation are unclear, but we do know that early on he developed a fondness for both his country and rock music. In his early teenage years, Linder would explore the many great artists and sounds that the rock genre had to offer, but all signs point to punk rock as being his personal favorite style, a genre thematically opposed to corporatism and oppressive authority. While employing a harder and more edgy sound than a lot of other works, there was one artist on the scene in particular whom Linder especially admired. Wendy Orlean Williams, lead singer of the American rock group The Plasmatics, was a hugely influential figure in Linder's life, with everything from her iconic sound to onstage theatrics becoming something which the boy would draw heavy inspiration from. Ironically though, Robert's taste in music was hardly indicative of his own outlook on authority, or on any of the other major themes so central to the works that he admired. As a teenager, Linder seems to have had a generally positive outlook on matters pertaining to the American government, corporatism, and the act of serving his country. So invested was he in fact that he deliberately lied about his age in order to join the armed forces earlier than he should have been able to, sometime in or around the year 2003, at which point he would have only been around 14 or 15 years old. Unfortunately for him, however, his time of enlistment just so happened to coincide with the start of the Second Central American War. This was a conflict instigated by the United States, which sought to eradicate the forces of many disparate pockets of Central and South American drug trading, whose influence had been felt in the country for years, and which, in the eyes of officials, was a plight that could likely be squashed without much resistance thanks to new military technology that had emerged around this time. Or at least, this was the thinly veiled excuse for a cause given by officials. In reality, the hope was that the war would result in a seizure of territory. As such, Linder was deployed to Nicaragua under the combined authority of the Department of Defense and Drug Enforcement Agency, where he would serve as a small part of a robust plan of attack focused not only around Nicaragua itself, but also the countries of Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and and Venezuela. The war was to be a massive undertaking, but one which many soldiers would have believed would result in real positive impact back on American soil. And, as the story goes, they couldn't have been more wrong. While the exact magnitude of the personnel lost is unknown, we know it's a number that can safely be summarized as many thousands, and in fact, it's said that Linder very nearly became one of the casualties himself, were it not for the bold heroics of a personal friend who sacrificed their own life in order to save his. Robert may never have returned home at all. Already, morale on the front lines was low, and this was only within the first couple of months of what would go on to be a 7-year-long conflict, which was destined to be mismanaged at every step of the way by the Gang of Four, the secretive political cabal responsible for orchestrating the fight. This would cause a great deal of the soldiery to desert before the end of 2003, including Linder himself. However, there was a trade-off. Such deserters would be marked, and have their government-issued SIN numbers erased as punishment, which would have made it nearly impossible to continue to live on American soil. Dejected, embittered, and heartbroken, Linder made for Night City, whose sovereignty meant that the locale would be largely free of the treasonous allegations of his home country, and it was here that he would undergo a major change of character and of heart. His regard for authority was thoroughly and irrevocably crushed, for not only had he lost a close friend, but also his left arm, potentially at the same time, although we're not sure. The zeal with which he had enlisted was indicative of a more naive man than he had since become, and soon he began to associate his own name, Robert John Linder, as being the name of the boy who saw government and corporate authority with favor. It was the name with which he had enlisted, and as a result, for the rest of his life, Robert would start going by a diminutive version of his middle name, John, instead. And after receiving an Arasaka cyberarm to replace the one he'd lost, the man we know today as Johnny Silverhand would be born. In Night City, Johnny rediscovered his love for rock, having gained a new appreciation and understanding of many of his favorite works from earlier in life. He now empathized with the vitriol that such works directed at corporate America, and combined with the bustling local rock scene offered in Night City, it didn't take Johnny long to pick up a guitar for himself. It was also probably through music that Johnny first met Kerry Eurodyne. A fellow veteran of the Second Conflict and an aspiring rocker himself, Kerry and Johnny quickly became close friends, bonding over their shared love of music, and the two men would also frequently spend time with Nancy Hartley, a woman who was at the time a member of a local booster gang. It wasn't long until Silverhand and Eurodyne began thinking of starting their own music group to rival those they would see at local bars and clubs around Night City. From the beginning, the two had wanted to produce music that was reflective of their experiences during the war, intended to be chock full of social and political commentary. Both men were competent musicians at this point, and had grievances to express, but while they were equally invested in the production, they didn't yet have a name for their would-be group. It wasn't until Hartley suggested the name Samurai that the pieces would begin to come together. But the story behind the name Samurai is a bit more nuanced than it may at first seem. According to Mike Pondsmith, the title of Samurai was meant to allude to the mindset of the real samurai of feudal Japan, who have gained infamy throughout history for their zealous dedication to a cause, regardless of moral justification. This would serve as a direct parallel to Kerry and Johnny's respective experiences in the war, as well as the authority-minded values they'd thrown away. It was an ironic name, rife with deep-cut symbolism, and it was hard to deny that it was a good fit. But as the story goes, the name wasn't actually adopted for these reasons at all, but rather simply because Kerry and Johnny thought it sounded cool. And so it was that Samurai was born. The band would consist of 5 members, starring of course Johnny Silverhand and Kerry Eurodyne, as we've discussed at length, both of whom alternated between vocals as well as rhythm and lead guitar. Next, Nancy Hartley would presumably take her leave from the gang life and joined the band she had helped name as the keyboardist. And additionally, they also picked up a bassist named Henry, as well as a woman named Denny on drums sometime prior to their first gig. It's not exactly clear how Henry and Denny came to meet the group, or how they became part of it, but nevertheless, it's clear that they were talented musicians and definitely had what it took in the eyes of the other 3 members. Now, at this point, I'm going to do my best to recount a full timeline of Samurai's work throughout their time as a band to the best of my ability. The thing is, though, there is some indication that the current accepted timeline may not be entirely correct. I just want to put this out there ahead of time for full transparency's sake, because while some initial source material points to the band as having gotten together in 2003, shortly after Johnny and Kerry arrived in Night City and became became friends, the sheer amount of stuff that happened for Samurai this year, even after what we've already discussed, certainly raises some eyebrows and makes some interpretations of events seem more implausible. That being said, there's also some things in Cyberpunk 2077 that seem to point to this interpretation of the timeline still being correct as well. So in a similar manner to my AHQ disaster video, a lot of what we'll discuss up through the early 2020s is indicative of myself and the community's best guess as to what's what. This interpretation sticks with the initial dates given in the 2020 source books, including that the band was formed in 2003, which means, as we'll see, 2003 is going to be kind of packed, but since the only real justification for a new timeline of events is seen in Johnny Silverhand's notoriously untrustworthy memories in Cyberpunk 2077, and in a tweet from around the time of the game's release by Artelsaurian Games, which unfortunately supplies only a nebulous hint in the right direction, I'm sticking with what is potentially a somewhat outdated, though still far and away the most overt timeline of events in this video, simply because, truth be told, it actually still fits the overall narrative of Cyberpunk pretty well. A few inconsistencies have resulted from Cyberpunk 2077, but many have to do with odd album release dates, all of which we'll discuss as this video continues, and you'll have the opportunity to evaluate each instance of confliction for yourself. Anyway, with that, let's actually get into it. Samurai would start off the way most small-time bands do, playing at clubs, bars, and various venues around Night City. It's said that their first ever gig was played in the Red Dirt Rock Bar, in the area known today as Santo Domingo. Later on, this bar would receive a level of acclaim for being the first place ever to host the legendary band, an accolade that likely contributed to the bar's continued operation even 74 years later. At this point, a lot of what we know about Samurai's history comes from an interview with Kerry as seen in the Cyberpunk 2020 sourcebook simply entitled Rocker Boy, which presents itself as an issue of a music magazine. It's here that Eurodyne first alluded to the band's big break, which propelled them from local to global acclaim almost overnight. We had just finished a late-night set at the Rainbow Cadenza, and I was about to chip into an old Zone program I had when this skinny, wild-eyed dwarf head came up to us and says, "You guys were great, I have to book your act." Naturally, we all thought he was so doped out that he didn't know what he was saying, let alone who he was. Denny, our drummer, got up and prepared to beat the living shit out of him with the chair she picked up, but the guy tossed a card down on our table. I couldn't believe what it said. The guy she'd almost trashed was none other than Jack Masters, head of Universal Music. From here, it took only 3 weeks for Samurai to be signed, have a record in production, and enter the preparation stages for a world tour. Things were moving fast, and much of that early success was driven by their first single, Blistering Love, which achieved a #1 spot on the Euro charts on release. This momentum would help Samurai maintain relevance until the release of the full Blistering Love album sometime later. A little side note here, as of Cyberpunk 2077, there's some confusion surrounding this album, since the release date, as seen in Kerry Eurodyne's villa, reads January 1st, 2007, but this simply cannot be the case as it's stated to be the band's breakout sensation. Perhaps this can be explained as the date in which an alternate version or collectible edition of the album was released, as this unit appears to be. In the years that followed, the band would achieve nationwide and subsequently worldwide stardom, selling out venues around the globe, which Kerry also elaborates on. I don't know why people took to Samurai the way they did. I'm not complaining, but it sometimes makes me wonder. After all, so many people try to make it to the top, but only a few really get there. The really shocking thing about the whole deal was the transition we had to make. 1 minute we're chugging through our old numbers in some small, no-name club to the same crowd. The next, we've sold out Wembley Stadium, and there are 100,000 killing each other to get a look at us. In total, Samurai produced 6 albums together in their initial time as a band. Aside from Blistering Love, the names of the other 5 albums, 2 of which were studio productions, with the other 3 being live recordings produced by Universal, remain unknown. And despite what Kerry's music collection shows, Chippin was almost certainly not among them. All signs point to the Chippin song as having been recorded by Johnny Silverhand in his solo album A Cool Metal Fire, which we'll discuss a bit later on. So the given release date of March 27th, 2024 is likely erroneous. Regardless, we do know that tracks such as Alike Supreme, The Ballad of Buck Ravers, and Archangel would have likely seen release during this span of time, each of which is able to be heard throughout Cyberpunk 2077 2077, portrayed in-game by the real-life Swedish punk band Refused. These works maintain the same punk rock style and portray lyrics which speak to Samurai's social commentary aspect very well, with the influence of wartime experience present in the lyricism. But sadly, only around 4 years after their initial rise, the Samurai legacy would be cut short, with the first and only major hit to their momentum. In 2007, the ugly side of the band's fame would reveal itself thanks to media coverage of an incident involving Nancy Hartley that would sour the band's perception by a considerable margin. Kerry reveals in the Rocker Boy interview that he believes a lot of the vitriol dedicated toward Samurai at the time was more as a result of media vultures than the actual actions of anyone involved. But nevertheless, well, I'll let the article speak for itself. Early in 2007, Samurai suffered a blow that would split the band apart. Although a small faction pointed to the entire trial as an example of the violence that was indicative of rock, Kerry disagrees. Samurai's breakup wasn't at all like the media portrayed it, and certainly not what the reformed moral majority decreed it to be. There was no internal politicking or hatred toward Nancy, our keyboardist, because of what happened, nor do I see her reaction coming as a direct result of her being involved in music. Her actions were extreme, but I still agree it was the right thing to do. We all knew that Nancy was getting really involved with this guy, but we never guessed that she wanted to marry him. It only took about 10 weeks after the ceremony for us to realize that she was faced with some dwarf corp that got his kicks out of slapping her around. Finally, she came to us and said he was making her quit the band. To us, that was the last straw. Johnny and I started over to her place with the intent of rearranging the dwarf's head, but it was over by the time we got there. The guy had started beating Nancy again when she finally decided that true love didn't mean being a sadist's punching bag. I guess he never knew she used to be a kicker for a local booster gang, but he sure as hell found out. His mistake. The coroner said he must have flown at least 100 yards after being thrown from the 83rd story penthouse. After the trial, Nancy came back to us again, ready to play. The only problem was that the 7 months she'd spent in jail were enough to put a slip in the band that we just couldn't heal. So, we went our separate ways. And that was that. Samurai was done. To say that they went as soon as they came is sort of a trite or overused statement, but one which really does apply here. The initial run of the band was extremely short-lived, and even in that small span of time, they were able to accomplish quite a lot. Although initially considered punk rock, we are told that Samurai was just unique in a way that couldn't be said of a lot of other bands. A uniqueness that would eventually see them retroactively dubbed as one of the first chrome rock bands when the subgenre rose to prominence later in time. Despite the breakup though, it seems that many of the former Samurai members were left on relatively good terms throughout the years to come, with Kerry even remarking, "I still see Nancy occasionally. She's changed her name to Bess Isis and has a great career in the media working for 54. I guess she never got over her love of the spotlight." Henry stopped playing the bass a couple of years ago after a MIDI accident shorted him out. He was working with Blaze Tech on one of the human interface prototypes when a spike in the voltage jumped circuits and fried some important connections. He's slowly regaining his memory and is now able to use some basic motor skills, but his nervous system was apparently rewired and they haven't figured out exactly how he's ticking. Denny has a new band called Mastermind that's being recorded by DMS. She knows how I feel about them, but the contract they've got is suitable for her, so I'm not going to interfere as long as she's happy. As it turns out, DMS was the same label that Kerry had first reached out to after the band's collapse, in hopes of securing a solo gig. But although he was initially accepted, Samurai's original publisher, Universal, offered both him and Johnny Silverhand separate solo signings with better perks, after which DMS was said to have launched an aggressive campaign to win Kerry back, which disenfranchised him with the entire label. Besides, staying with Universal had consequently ensured that Kerry and Johnny would be able to see each other relatively often at shows and helped the two stay close in touch. I'm not sure that Johnny and I are inseparable, but we do a lot of the same things and have many of the same beliefs. The package deal worked out by Universal gave more to both of us, because we were both well known for our Samurai days. By re-signing us both, they guaranteed us concessions normally only offered to major bands or superstars. I suppose you could call us superstars now, certainly Johnny is, but back then we were a couple of new boy guitarists who had some success with a band. Buying us on on contract was a risk, but I don't think they're complaining. Indeed, the line about Johnny being a superstar in particular is a rather poignant one, as it's safe to say that Silverhand came out of Samurai's Breakup as far and away the most successful member. He continued to play solo for several decades, in which time he would orchestrate a raid on Arasaka Tower in 2013 to rescue Alt Cunningham after debuting the legendary Chippin during a riot in front of the building. That same year, he would release A Cool Metal Fire, the solo album discussed earlier, containing the new song along with the original version of another iconic Silverhand track, Never Fade Away, which would receive an album re-release of its own down the line. Some sources indicate that Never Fade Away may have actually been a cover of an earlier Samurai song by the same name, though this isn't entirely clear. It's primarily evidenced by the song being credited as a Samurai work in Cyberpunk Red's core rulebook and in the original album artwork used for the song uploaded to YouTube before Cyberpunk 2077 was released, though it seems that crediting the work to Samurai may have been a mistake, since the texture has since been updated to reflect Silverhand's authorship within the game. Are you confused yet? So am I, but we're not done. At the time of Kerry's magazine interview in 2020, it was mentioned that he also would be producing another album sometime soon, one which was more political than his previous works and dipped into the old Samurai style, drawing inspiration from he and Johnny's experience in the Second Conflict, though according to the data shard, Kerry Eurodyne Second Conflict New Album Review in Cyberpunk 2077, it doesn't seem that the piece was received all too well. Also, in the early 2020s, it was rumored that Samurai had or would once again begin touring. In fact, Samurai 2020 t-shirts had been created and began circulating around Night City, even obtainable by the time of Cyberpunk 2077. Interestingly though, it's unclear whether this tour ever actually happened. The commonly accepted theory is that the shirts were actually printed by Johnny as a joke. The more likely scenario though, and the one which evidence seems to support, is the idea that Samurai did in fact briefly get together in 2020 to create the Chippin album, in which a cover of Johnny's titular 2013 song would be recorded, though this area of canon, as well as the level of participation from all previous band members, is still somewhat debated. Either way, it's not particularly likely that the band's association would have continued into 2023, as shown in Johnny's faulty memories from Cyberpunk 2077. The reason this is unlikely though is because 2023 marks the year in which Johnny, as a solo act, recorded his last original piece of music, one which, in time, would be retroactively marked as a Samurai work, though not recorded with them. This year, Johnny recorded a new song that would come to be known as Black Dog, but during the AHQ disaster, also known as the Night City Holocaust, an event in which Arasaka Tower was bombed using a pocket nuke thanks to the joint effort headed by Johnny Silverhand himself, as well as the famed solo Morgan Blackhand, the recording, and Johnny's life, would sadly be lost. That being said, word of its existence would spread amongst private collectors and Samurai fans, resulting in a multi-decade-long search effort to find and restore the original masters. One of the first pieces to this puzzle was a small snippet of a session recording that was taken at a club where Johnny was either practicing or performing the song after hours. Either way, the recording did not contain the full lyrics, but it gave fans something to work with in pursuit of the longer recording. Contrary to public knowledge at the time though, the chip that the masters was kept on had actually been found almost immediately in the direct aftermath of the disaster by none other than Samantha Stevens, a full-Borg firefighter who also just so happened to be a massive Johnny Silverhand superfan. As a matter of fact, Stevens owned a number of Silverhand's old belongings right up until her death sometime in or around the 2040s, including his car, a Porsche 911 Turbo. She also undoubtedly understood that the chip with the unreleased song would have been extraordinarily valuable if sold, but instead, she kept her discovery of it a secret, especially since the chip itself had been damaged by an EMP blast as a byproduct of the AHQ bombing, rendering it unplayable. It wasn't until 2045 when Stevens discovered that the small amount of organic matter left in her body had developed cancer as a result of exposure to radiation on the day of the disaster that she decided to share knowledge of the song with a young Silverhand fan named Lilia, who had put out a call for information about Black Dog on the local net. This would serve as the inciting events events of a story included in the Cyberpunk Red core book, aptly entitled Black Dog, in which Stevens would trade Lilia and company a copy of the original corrupted data chip in return for safe delivery of a crate containing an undetonated nuke that, unbeknownst to anyone in the group, contained Johnny Silverhand's own body to a lab in Los Alamos, New Mexico. If that sounds confusing and extremely bizarre, I assure you that that's because it is. After the successful delivery of the crate, Lilia and her friends were able to restore the lost recording, and so, for the first time, Silverhand's Black Dog was made available to the public, a full 22 years after it was first recorded, though in Cyberpunk 2077, it's often attributed to Samurai rather than Silverhand himself, as we've already discussed. In reality, the search for Black Dog was indicative of a larger sentiment to rediscover and catalog Samurai's history in the coming decades. As we touched on earlier, the data crash had taken a toll on online cataloging of all kinds, so rebuilding and rediscovering the band's history is an undertaking that persists even now in 2077. At this point though, it seems that much of Samurai's musical history has been restored through the efforts of fans both old and new. By the time Johnny Silverhand's engram was recovered by V, old Samurai songs were still receiving play on the radio, and street bands still dreamed of emulating Samurai's sound and success in the modern age. But the last thing anyone could have expected was for Samurai themselves to come back and play one last gig 69 years after breaking up. And yet, that's exactly what happened. When V, equipped with Johnny's engram, paid an unexpected visit to Kerry Eurodyne's villa in North Oak, what starts as a rocky encounter ends up catalyzing one of the game's most in-depth and heartwarming questlines. V lets Johnny take over the body, at which point Kerry recognizes Johnny from his signature sound on the guitar. The two take some time to catch up, where it's revealed that despite Kerry's lavish house and lifestyle, he's dejected, yearning for the old days of playing with Samurai, and so Kerry, Johnny, and V take it upon themselves to track down the band's former members.
Maybe get together? You know, jam or something?
You want to bring Samurai back?
No. Could do one gig, play some dive where nobody plays us. I mean, got my reputation to think about.
Alright, let's do it.
First, V is given the number of Bess Isis, aka Nancy Hartley, who they track down at the Totentans, a gang bar controlled by Maelstrom, all while Kerry collects the other two members, Henry and Denny. We find out upon arriving at Denny's residence, though, that there's a bit of bad blood between the two. They actually seem to have been together for a brief time after Samurai broke up, which causes some tension. Henry fills Denny's pool with concrete, it's a whole thing. Ultimately, it becomes clear that both members simply will not play if the other is going to be involved, so the decision is V's to make as to whether Henry or Denny is going to be the one to stay in. After that, the gang heads for the Red Dirt Bar, the very same bar that was the first to host Samurai all those years ago. Upon arrival, Nancy will present V with Johnny's old guitar, and after letting him take over the body once again, the concert would be underway. In their final show, the band would perform a rendition of A Like Supreme, with Kerry on vocals, Nancy Hartley on keyboard, Henry or Denny on bass or drums respectively, and of course Johnny Silverhand in the body of V on lead guitar. This is the final performance of Samurai to date. After the show, Kerry remarks that he had a good time, and Johnny's engram entrusts his old friend with his guitar as a keepsake, before downing a pill and retreating back to the recessive part of V's mind once more. After that, V and Kerry take their leave, but not before Kerry hands over an iconic weapon for your troubles, the very same gun which he first pointed at Johnny at the beginning of the questline. And just like that, Samurai would split again, for presumably the final time, in typical fashion just as quickly as they got together. Ever since first learning about the history of this band beyond what's seen in Cyberpunk 2077, I've always felt that the story of Samurai was a particularly heartwarming one, in its own kind of twisted way. In a setting like Night City that's so saturated with cynicism, corruption, and the vices of technology, the story of Samurai is ultimately nothing more than one of a group of friends that enjoyed making and listening to music. Though some of its members, especially Johnny Silverhand, have gone on to become some of the biggest names in all of Cyberpunk lore, the concept of the band remains a symbol of a bygone era for the series. I can't help but think about the contrast between the rapid and ongoing advancement that defines Night City at the time of 2077, juxtaposed with the fact that many, many people in this world still listen and pay tribute to samurai all this time later. Perhaps it really is true that no amount of chrome or convenience can truly stop people from yearning for and idealizing the past, a time where rocker boys could stick it to the corpse through song, or at least so they say. As such, I personally think this is one of the few times in the Cyberpunk series where a storyline may really be well and truly done. I don't think we'll be seeing any substantial new developments with samurai in later material, nor do I particularly think we should. Just like Kerry, perhaps we should be content with the memory of the time spent with them in 2077, and through reading old interviews present in 2020. They may be gone, but in the minds of fans both in and out of universe, the greatest rock band in cyberpunk history will never fade away. Well, here we are again at the end of yet another video, and per the usual, I just wanted to say thanks for watching. I really appreciate you guys taking the time to continue to watch these uploads, and I gotta say, not only was this topic long overdue, but I think it was also some of the most fun I've had covering cyberpunk lore yet. There's just something so cool about cyberpunk's rock undertones, and I've never really gotten a chance to touch on it all that much, so I'm excited to finally cover samurai in their entirety, and I hope that you guys had some fun too. Per the usual, if you enjoyed today, I'd love to see you stick around and subscribe. I've got even more cyberpunk-related content on the way, as well as some additional content relating to non-cyberpunk IPs that you may find interesting. Anyway, I'll keep the ending rather short here. I don't have too much to say this time around, I guess. So with that, this is Averberon. I'll see you again soon, and have a good one.